In the spring of 1996, in a quiet community outside Roanoke, Virginia, a young woman vanished from her own wedding without a trace. Investigators were left with nothing. Decades passed, and hope faded until one forgotten object surfaced, and it changed everything. The Blue Ridge Mountains around Roanoke have always carried a sense of quiet permanence. In the mid-90s, before smartphones and constant noise, life in these suburban neighborhoods moved at a gentle pace, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name. Weekend cookouts were community events, and front doors stayed unlocked through the afternoon. Nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen here. At the center of that world was 26-year-old Lena Carter, steady, warm, the kind of person who put people at ease without trying. She worked at a local medical clinic, guiding nervous patients through appointments with a reassuring smile, and was well loved by everyone who knew her. She wasn't a risk-taker. She was grounded, responsible, and for the past 3 years, her life had included Ethan Brooks, a 28-year-old local contractor with a quiet, steady nature. They'd met at a summer cookout through mutual friends, and the connection had been immediate. Their relationship wasn't dramatic. It was built on trust. When Ethan proposed on the porch of the starter house he was renovating for them, Lena cried from pure happiness. Their wedding, set for a Saturday in late May when the Virginia dogwoods were in full bloom, was the talk of the town. Lena's parents, Richard and Margaret Carter, were overjoyed, respected, church-going people who poured themselves into planning their only daughter's perfect day. But underneath the tulle and the flower arrangements, something had started to shift. In the weeks before the ceremony, Margaret began noticing small things. Lena, always so present, started to drift sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, staring out at the tree line, twisting her engagement ring around her finger without seeming to notice she was doing it. One afternoon, addressing invitations together, Margaret gently asked if she was getting cold feet, if something was wrong. Lena blinked, as if surfacing from somewhere else, and forced a bright smile. "Just tired," she said. "Just the wedding and the long hours at the clinic." Margaret wanted to believe her. She hugged her daughter and tried to ignore the feeling that Lena's smile hadn't reached her eyes. What Margaret didn't know, what no one around Lena could have guessed, was that her daughter was carrying something far heavier than wedding stress. A few weeks before the ceremony, Lena had told Ethan she was meeting a coworker for coffee after her shift. The coworker later said she hadn't seen Lena that afternoon at all. Wherever Lena had gone, she'd gone alone, to meet someone she was determined to keep hidden from everyone she loved. She came home pale that evening, claiming a migraine, and went straight to bed, shivering under the covers despite the mild weather. Days before the wedding, she did something stranger still. On her lunch break, she went to a county records office and, glancing over her shoulder, like someone worried about being seen, requested certified copies of her own birth records. It made no sense. Her parents kept every childhood document she owned in a fireproof safe at home. She never mentioned the request to Ethan or her mother. She folded the paperwork into the bottom of her purse and went back to work, carrying a secret that was slowly tearing her apart. The wedding day arrived under a flawless blue sky. The venue was a historic country church just outside town, white clapboard gleaming in the sun, its heavy doors open to welcome more than 150 guests. Inside, the altar was banked with white roses and lilies, the pews full of familiar faces and warm conversation. At the front, Ethan stood with his best man, checking his watch, unable to stop smiling. In the bridal suite, Lena stood before the mirror in a cascade of ivory silk, her childhood best friend Chloe adjusting the train, her mother dabbing her eyes nearby. "You look perfect, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, pinning the veil into place. For 1 second, in the mirror, Lena's face carried a look of such heavy sorrow that Margaret would spend the next 2 decades turning it over in her mind. Then it was gone, and Lena squeezed her mother's hand and thanked her softly. Margaret kissed her cheek and left for her seat in the front pew. Chloe crossed the room to gather the bouquets, A florist worked quietly in the corner, trimming stems. Then came a knock. Chloe opened the door to find one of Ethan's teenage cousins, awkward in his rented tuxedo, holding a small folded piece of paper. "Sorry to interrupt," he mumbled. "Someone outside asked me to give this to the bride. Said it was important." Assuming it was a note from Ethan, Chloe passed it to Lena. Lena's fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The florist, glancing up at exactly that moment, would later describe watching every trace of color drain from Lena's face, her breath catching, her eyes going wide with something closer to terror than surprise. The note was short. "Please come outside alone. Someone's life depends on it." Lena didn't scream or cry. She went eerily calm and methodical instead, setting down her bouquet, unbuckling her shoes and lining them up neatly on the floor, unpinning her veil and letting it settle over the back of a chair. Chloe turned, confused. "Lena, what are you doing? It's almost time." Lena forced a tight smile. "I just need a minute. Fresh air. I'll be right back." She slipped out, the note still clutched in her hand. 5 minutes passed. Chloe checked the hallway, empty. 10 minutes. She pushed open the side door into the gravel lot, squinting against the sun. Rows of parked cars, rustling oaks, birdsong, no bride. Inside the sanctuary, the organist looped the prelude a second time, then a third, while whispers spread through the pews and Ethan's smile slowly gave way to confusion. By the 20-minute mark, Margaret was moving down the aisle at a near run, Ethan close behind her. They found Chloe standing frozen in the bridal suite, hands over her mouth. The room was empty. The shoes sat on the floor. The veil lay over the chair. The bouquet rested untouched on the table. In the corner, Lena's purse sat exactly where she'd left it: wallet, cash, car keys, everything a person needs to live her life. All of it abandoned. Ethan ran outside, screaming her name into the parking lot. Guests spilled out of the church behind him, fanning across the lawn and into the trees. Margaret collapsed on the church steps, sobbing into her husband's arms. Within minutes, sirens tore through the quiet afternoon. Detective Vance Caldwell arrived to find a scene that told him almost nothing. People taken against their will leave signs, scuffed floors, knocked over furniture, torn fabric. This room was immaculate. Lena had calmly removed her most restrictive clothing and walked out in her stocking feet. The one real clue, the note, was nowhere to be found. Officers tore the church apart, searching for it. Trash cans, plumbing, under every pew, inside every bridesmaid's pocket. Nothing. Since the dress had no pockets, the note had to have left with Lena, clutched in her hand. The teenage usher, questioned through tears, said someone had simply tapped his shoulder in the crowded hallway and handed him the note without him ever seeing a face. Man or woman, young or old, he had no idea. With no forced entry and no physical evidence, the department's leading theory quickly became the one that devastated the family most: cold feet. Investigators floated the idea that the note might have meant nothing at all, maybe even a blank page, just the final straw for a woman overwhelmed by wedding pressure, panicking, shedding her dress, and running to start over somewhere new. Margaret erupted when Caldwell raised it with her. She wasn't a coward, Margaret insisted. She'd spent 2 years happily planning every detail of a life with Ethan. She loved him completely. And she would never, under any circumstance, abandon a church full of family and friends, let alone run barefoot into the woods without her purse, her money, or a single key to anything she owned. No one fought the theory harder than Ethan. The image of him that afternoon would stay with the responding officers for years: his tuxedo jacket discarded on the grass, his tie loose, mud on his knees and blood on his hands from tearing through the brush behind the church. But police procedure meant looking hardest at the fiancé first. And Ethan sat through 6 hours of questioning without asking for a lawyer, answering every question, begging them to stop wasting time on him and go find whoever had taken her. He passed a polygraph without hesitation, and 20 guests confirmed he'd never once left the altar. Cleared, he went home to the empty house he'd spent months fixing up for a wife who was no longer there. The investigation found new legs when the florist finally gave a full statement. She hadn't just seen Lena's color drain, she'd seen the specific look of someone who'd been handed a death sentence, not a case of nerves. It confirmed the note was real, and whatever it said had been terrifying enough to make a happy bride vanish without a sound. Detectives canvassed the parking lot witnesses and got nothing but noise: a black Lincoln, a dark blue Ford, a dark green sedan with out-of-state plates nobody could place. The car lead dissolved into contradictions. A more promising thread emerged when a junior detective found that Julian Hayes, Lena's college boyfriend, had returned to town the exact weekend of the wedding after years away. For a moment, they thought they had their man until his employer produced time-stamped photos and swipe card logs, putting him in a conference room 40 miles away at the exact moment Lena disappeared. Weeks passed. The search parties thinned out. The flowers in the church wilted and were swept away. Then Caldwell, retracing the route from the church on his own, spotted a security camera outside a roadside feed store, a mile down the highway, angled straight at the road any fleeing car would have used. He asked for the weekend's tapes. The manager told him, confused, that a man claiming to be a private investigator hired by the family had already paid $300 in cash to take the original recording days earlier, saying the police needed it for the file. No one from the department and no one the family had hired had ever gone. Someone had erased the only camera footage in the case before the police even thought to look for it. It meant this wasn't opportunistic. Whoever was behind it had money, organization, and had been a full step ahead of the investigation from the start. 2 weeks in, a waitress at a diner in rural North Carolina called the tip line a woman matching Lena's description. Exhausted, paying cash, no wedding ring but a fresh pale line where one had been. Caldwell drove 4 hours to sit across from her, and she was certain. But the diner's cameras recorded over themselves every 3 days. There was no receipt, no plate number, nothing to confirm it, just another ghost. A wedding guest later came forward to admit he'd left something out of his original statement. He'd seen a man in a dark suit near the tree line before the ceremony, watching the bridal suite window, but hadn't reported it out of fear the police would suspect him instead. By the time he spoke up, his memory of the man's face had blurred to nothing. A financial audit dug up the co-worker's denial about the coffee meeting, and buried in county records, the birth certificate request Lena had filed days before she disappeared. When Caldwell showed Margaret the request form, she stared at her daughter's signature. Bewildered, Lena had never needed to ask for those records. They were sitting in a safe at home the whole time. Only then did Margaret admit, through tears, what she'd been ignoring for weeks: the staring out windows, the ring twisting, the fear behind Lena's eyes when she thought no one was watching. By winter, the leads had dried up completely. Without a body, a crime scene, or the note, there was nothing left to chase. The case slid from front-page news into the cold case files. Time did what it always does. The Carters grew old in the same house, keeping Lena's room untouched and the phone number unchanged, just in case. Ethan eventually sold the house he'd renovated, unable to bear the quiet, and threw himself into his construction business in a neighboring county. He never forgot her. Neither did the town. 21 years slipped by. It was the summer of 2017. Chloe, now a mother of 3 in her late 40s, was clearing out her late parents' attic when she found a plastic bin marked wedding stuff, untouched since 1996. Inside were dried wedding programs, a ring bearer's pillow, and 5 disposable cameras Lena had set out for guests to use during a reception that never happened. One of them showed a counter reading 0 instead of 24. The film had been fully shot. Chloe remembered Ethan's young cousins running wild on the church lawn. Before the ceremony, they must have found a camera and played with it. On a long shot, she took all 5 to a photo restoration lab. 3 weeks later, an email arrived with a digital gallery. Most of it was exactly what she expected: blurry shots of the parking lot, an out-of-focus squirrel, a crooked photo of the minister. Then, in the 14th image, she stopped breathing. It was Lena's shot from across the lawn, barefoot, the folded note visible in her hand, walking stiffly away from the bridal suite door. The timestamp lined up with the exact minute the panic had started inside the church. Chloe drove straight to the police station. Caldwell had retired years earlier. The case now belonged to a younger detective, David Miller. When he saw the photo, he sent the digital file to the State Forensic Imaging Lab and asked them to pull every detail they could out of the background. The next day, a technician isolated a shadowed section of the frame near a massive oak tree at the edge of the lot and lifted the contrast. Half hidden behind the trunk was a man in a dark suit, hands in his pockets, not looking at the church or the guests, staring directly at Lena. Nobody on the guest list, the catering staff, or the church roster matched him. Facial recognition expanded across old DMV archives in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, finally returned a match on the fourth day. Victor Harris, a retired Maryland law enforcement officer who'd moved into private investigative work after retiring in the late 80s, someone trained to disappear into a crowd without being noticed, which explained exactly how he'd walked away from a church swarming with police in 1996. Miller's relief didn't last. Victor Harris had died of a heart attack in the winter of 2011, taking whatever he knew to the grave. But dead men leave paper. Victor's estranged daughter in Baltimore hadn't thrown out his files after his death. She'd simply boxed the entire contents of his home office and shoved it into a cheap storage unit on the outskirts of the city, and never gone back. Miller and his partner drove out with a warrant, cut the rusted padlock with bolt cutters, and spent 8 exhausting hours digging through old tax returns, hunting magazines, and mildewed financial records before finding, in the bottom drawer of a dented gray filing cabinet, a single thick manila folder labeled Roanoke, May 1996. Inside was proof Victor had been obsessively watching Lena for weeks before the wedding newspaper clippings highlighted in yellow marker, a marked-up map of the church grounds with the exits and tree lines circled in red, and a stack of long-lens surveillance photos. Lena walking out of the clinic, pushing a cart through the grocery store, sitting on her own front porch with a cup of coffee. He hadn't shown up at that wedding on a whim. He'd learned her entire routine first. Tucked in the corner of the folder was a yellowed motel receipt from a roadside place 5 miles down the road from the church, dated the exact morning of the wedding, a noon check-in under the alias Arthur Kessler, a name Miller recognized instantly from Victor's file as one he used regularly for undercover surveillance work. Pulling the motel's archived guest ledger from county microfiche, Miller found something that changed the shape of the whole case. 10 minutes after Arthur Kessler checked into room 114, another guest, paying cash, checked into the room right next door, registered under the name Robert Ellis. A financial trace on that alias turned up a single gas station charge on a corporate card, and the card belonged not to a kidnapper or a jealous ex, but to a discreet private investigation firm based in Richmond. 2 investigators, adjoining rooms, both circling Lena on the exact same morning. A subpoena forced the Richmond firm to hand over its files. The retainer had been paid via untraceable cashier's checks, but the original April 1996 contract required a physical signature, and when Miller found it, the air went out of the room. It belonged to a member of Lena's own family. The investigator's field notes explained why. He hadn't been hired to watch Lena. He'd been hired to intercept Victor Harris, who'd spent months quietly working small-town courthouses, telling old acquaintances that the woman known as Lena Carter wasn't who she thought she was. The family had paid to shut him down before Lena ever found out what he was asking. Chasing that thread further, Miller filed an emergency order for Lena's childhood medical records and pulled a preserved blood sample from a fever she'd had at 6. He had a team quietly collect discarded Dina from the trash outside Richard and Margaret's home, a coffee cup, a chewed pen, and rushed all 3 samples to the state lab. 2 days later, the director called him directly rather than put it in writing. "We ran it 3 times to be sure," she said. Richard Carter is not her biological father. There's no genetic connection at all. Miller went straight into the state's sealed family court archives, requesting every custody case filed around Lena's birth year. Under a judicial override, he broke the seal on a case file from a county 300 miles away, and the entire mystery unraveled on the first page. In the early 1970s, Margaret had been married to a man named Thomas Sterling, living with him in a small Pennsylvania town, raising a daughter they'd named Elena. When the marriage collapsed, a bitter custody fight ended with the court awarding Thomas primary custody. Margaret didn't accept it. One night, with 4-year-old Elena asleep in the back seat, she packed a single suitcase and fled across state lines, eventually meeting Richard Carter in Virginia. Together they forged a birth certificate, renamed the girl Lena, and built an entire life around the lie Richard, raising a daughter who was in the eyes of the law a kidnapping victim, and never once telling her any different. Thomas Sterling never stopped looking. He spent his savings on investigators and years chasing false leads, staring at an empty chair every holiday, wondering if his daughter was safe or even remembered his face, before his search finally connected him with Victor Harris, who eventually traced the trail to a quiet Virginia suburb, and a young woman who had no idea her entire childhood had been built on a stolen name. Every strange detail of Lena's final month suddenly made sense. The secret meeting hadn't been an affair, it was Victor cornering her in the clinic parking lot, gently telling her that her name wasn't Lena, that Richard wasn't her father, that she'd been taken as a child. She hadn't believed him, but the doubt had taken root, which was why she'd quietly requested her own birth records, trying to prove him wrong, and instead finding inconsistencies she couldn't explain. Richard, realizing Victor was back in town, had hired the Richmond investigator to intercept and silence him before the wedding. But on the morning itself, Victor slipped past his tail and made it to the church. When the usher handed Lena that note, she knew exactly who'd sent it. "Please come outside alone. Someone's life depends on." It wasn't a threat, it was a last, desperate attempt to stop her from signing a marriage license under a name that had never legally been hers. Behind the oak tree, Victor wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a briefcase, childhood photos of a little girl named Elena, the original court orders, and years of letters her real father had written and never been able to send. Standing there in her wedding dress with the organ still playing inside, Lena's entire life came apart at once. The parents who raised her had, by law, stolen her. She could hear Ethan waiting at the altar, and no longer knew whose name she was supposed to take, or whose name she'd ever actually had. She couldn't walk back inside and marry a man under a lie that size. She couldn't stand beside the parents who'd built her whole existence on someone else's stolen grief. So she got into the car Victor had waiting at the edge of the woods, driven by the legal team already working to reopen the custody matter, and left everything behind in the gravel lot, meaning, at first, only to understand the truth and then come back and explain. But the shame grew faster than her nerve. Weeks became months, months became years, and the longer she stayed away, the more unforgivable coming back seemed. So she stayed hidden and let the world believe she was simply gone. With a real name, Elena Sterling Miller found her within minutes in a federal employment database, 47 years old, living in a small town in Ohio. He flew out the next morning and found her in the sunroom of an assisted living facility, gently holding the hand of a sleeping resident, wearing faded scrubs instead of silk. She'd spent 2 decades quietly caring for the elderly, as if trying to balance out a debt only she believed she owed. When she saw his badge, she didn't run. She closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped free. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I've been waiting for it for 21 years. She told him everything: the oak tree, the drive away from the church, the hundreds of times she'd dialed Ethan's number and hung up before it rang, certain she'd ruined his life and had no right to ask forgiveness. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she said. "I just didn't know who I was anymore, and by the time I figured it out, it felt too late to go back." The truth broke over the town in waves. Margaret confessed everything, weeping, telling police that fear of losing her daughter had driven her to a crime with no statute of limitations left to punish it, though the judgment of a community that had trusted her for decades proved a harder sentence than any court could hand down. Neighbors who'd known her for 30 years stopped meeting her eyes at the grocery store. The church she'd been part of her whole adult life never quite felt the same again. The hardest reunion was with Ethan, now in his late 40s, married with children of his own, gray coming in at his temples. When Elena walked into the room and fell to her knees in front of him, sobbing, begging him to understand the terror that had swallowed her that day, he didn't turn away. He crossed the room, knelt down, and pulled her into his arms, weeping into her shoulder, grieving, all over again, the life they were never going to have. They could never get back the 21 years. But he told her he was just glad, more than anything else, that she was alive. She also traveled to Pennsylvania to meet Thomas Sterling for the first time in over 4 decades. He was frail by then, his health failing, a man who'd spent his whole adult life waiting for a single moment. But when he looked at his daughter's face, something in him lit up that had been dark since 1974, and in his last years, he finally got the one thing he'd never stopped asking for. The case that had haunted Roanoke for 21 years never had a monster in it at all, just a lie, buried deep enough to survive 2 generations, that finally cracked under its own weight. The wedding hadn't been interrupted by a crime in progress. It had been interrupted by the truth, arriving 22 years too late for the man who'd lost his daughter as a toddler, and 21 years too early for the woman who'd spent that whole time believing silence was the kindest thing she had left to give anyone. A life built on a lie can look steady for a long time. It can hold a wedding, raise a child, fill a church with 150 smiling guests. But eventually, the ground gives, the way it always does, and everything that was buried underneath it comes back up into the light, whether anyone is ready for it or not.